name of the holy and living God, amen. Please be seated. So a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with a parent I've gotten to know in recent months who belongs to an Eastern religious tradition best known for its values of nonviolence, peace, and hospitality. His children attend an elite, mostly white private school, and he said that one of the hardest things since the election has been not knowing where the people around him stand, especially at his children's school. I used to see people as my neighbors, fellow parents, fellow New Yorkers. Now I can't help but wonder, who are you, really? Do you think DEI is spoiling your children's education? Do you think my family doesn't really belong here? Do you see non-white skin and non-Christian traditions as threats? The suspicions resonated with me. Sometimes when I'm on the train, I look at the people around me and I try to imagine something about their lives, who they might be. This is usually an exercise in compassion. I try to look past the stranger in front of me to see something beautiful about their humanity, something radiant in their spirit. But recently I found myself looking around a train car and wondering instead, how many of these people are part of the problem? What cruelty, what selfishness, what greed might be present among us right now? I could feel the tension and the anxiety rise in my body as the thoughts popped into my head. And I didn't want to be having these thoughts, but I couldn't seem to help it. That's what fear does. That's what the threat of rising injustice does. The dad went on to say that this kind of suspicion, the feeling that we don't know who our people are or where we are safe, it's disorienting and isolating. It corrodes all of our souls. And of course, it's not just the result of the election. The divisions in our country have been growing for many years now, and some of us, because of racism or sexism, homophobia or transphobia, have always had to be on high alert. But even in spaces that may have once felt safe, many of us are asking anew, who are my people? Whom can I trust? In our gospel reading for today, Jesus issues a radical call to communal life and social responsibility to a group of people who, like us, were living through a time of social division and political hostility. The Roman Empire had very clear ideas about who was valuable and who mattered. It thrived on keeping suspicions high and using whatever force was necessary to instill fear and inspire conformity. The people who came to hear Jesus were poor. Many of them were sick and outcast. They had been isolated from their communities. They had come to find healing, to find belonging. And my guess is that what they expected to hear was something like a campaign speech, a promise that their lives could be better if they pledged their support or gave up what little they had or agreed to take on the powers that be in some new way. In the ancient world, there were all kinds of itinerant preachers promising all kinds of things to desperate people. But Jesus offered them something different. Jesus offered them a path to freedom that was not dependent on Rome, but instead drew on their own dignity, their own worth, their own capacity for love. Love your enemies, he said. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Can you imagine how the crowd must have felt as they heard Jesus' words? You want us to do what? To love people who hate us? To give up more of ourselves? To let ourselves be treated more than we already have been? Where is the hope or the promise in that? Many of us today hear these words and think, sure, that's a really nice sentiment. But can we really afford it? Can we really afford to love each other at a moment when so much is at stake, when the threats are so real? The short answer is no, of course not. And yet this is what Jesus calls us to do. This was Jesus' call to the multitudes of hungry and downtrodden people who came to him desperate for a path out of the daily struggles of their lives. He was not encouraging them to be weak or to accept the way things were, but instead to stand firm in their values, to expose the injustices they suffered by taking the moral high ground, to hold on to themselves and to each other, even in the face of cruelty and violence, because that was the power they had. And to imagine that if they could live their lives rooted in the power and promise of God's love for them, then eventually things would begin to change. This is how nonviolent resistors have patterned their movements throughout history. And it's our call now. Jesus calls us to stand firm in who we are and who God has called us to be. Today we have to decide if we're going to give in or rise up. And if we're ready to rise up, then that means modeling what it means to lead lives of deep faith, of moral courage and moral imagination, and to build communities of radical hospitality rooted in the transformative love of Jesus Christ that has the power not only to change my life and your life, but to turn the whole world upside down. Be merciful, Jesus said. Forgive. Give. We cannot meet the world on its own terms. We are called to meet the world on God's terms, and that means that in times like these, we are called not only to be different, but to act differently, to model for each other and for those who can't see it what a world built on God's love could be. We cannot let ourselves be shaken. We cannot look at our neighbors with suspicion or disgust in our hearts. I'm talking just to myself here. I know none of you deal with that. Like the spiritual says, we have to be like trees planted by the water. We shall not be moved. We need to keep our hearts and our minds and our spirits alive. We need to hope more boldly than we have ever hoped before. Can we really afford to love everyone at a time when so much is at stake? In the short term, it feels as though we cannot. But if we take the long view, we will see that there is no other way. Moral courage means to commit to doing what is right now at all costs. Moral imagination means to plant seeds now for the future we know is possible. Maybe not for us, but for our children or for our children's children. And we never do this alone. We do this together by showing up for each other in community, by caring for each other, by refusing to accept that we don't matter, that we don't need each other, that our presence doesn't make a difference. Jesus looked out at the crowds of people who gathered around him. And even though they were sick and hungry and exhausted, he saw a people who were blessed and beloved. And he believed in them. He believed that they could learn to embody the kind of love that God had for them, the kind of love that had been given to them and that had spurred the whole world into being. He believed that by their love, by our love, God's kingdom could be possible on earth. So this is our task. This is our work, St. Mark's, to be people of moral courage, to be people of moral imagination, to love each other like we've never loved before, and to share that love as if it really could change everything, because it can. It starts small. It starts with our care for each other. It starts with the grace we can extend to strangers and friends. It starts with our efforts to stay connected, to keep showing up, to be kind and thoughtful, to take the time we need for rest and rejuvenation, for prayer and study, to be confident in our own value. And eventually, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, very soon, the world will begin to turn. And we will have been part of that. You all will have been part of that. And the Spirit of God's love will usher us all into a new way. Amen.
Amen.